7 hours and 11 minutes. That is the average amount of time an American adult spent looking at screens last year. Phones, tablets, laptops, televisions, every single day. That number comes from Data Reportal's 2025 Global Digital Report. 7 hours and 11 minutes every day. I want you to do a calculation with me before I say anything else. 7 hours and 11 minutes a day across 10 years. Not 10 years of exceptional consumption. Average consumption. The result is approximately 26,000 hours. 26,000 hours of images, sounds, and emotional experiences delivered directly into your imagination. Now let me tell you what I want you to understand about that number. Not from a cultural critic's perspective, not from a public health perspective. I'm going to tell you what it means in the precise framework that Padre Pio operated within for 50 years, and that Father Chad Ripperger has systematized in his work on the theology of diabolical oppression. 26,000 hours of raw material. And every hour of it has been handed, freely, voluntarily, without examination of what it contained, to every demonic entity assigned to you. I'll be honest, I wasn't sure I should open this way. I was a high school religion teacher for 35 years in Covington, Kentucky. I'm accustomed to making careful qualifications before I say anything that might alarm people. Tonight I'm going to resist that instinct, because what I am about to describe is not an idea that benefits from softening. It is a mechanism, a precise, documentable, observable mechanism. And if you understand the mechanism, you will understand why Padre Pio refused to own a radio. You will understand why Father Ripperger has made the connection between the modern scrolling algorithm and the specific pathology he identifies as diabolic obsession. And you will understand what Brian, a former student of mine, mid-40s, married with 3 children, daily communicant, was doing to himself for 4 years without knowing it. And why the intrusive, violent thoughts that tormented him every morning, despite years of monthly confession, did not stop until he did one specific thing. This is a battlefield briefing. Here it is one. The battlefield is your imagination. In a letter to his spiritual director, Father Agostino of San Marco in Lamis, written in March of 1912, Padre Pio described something that has occupied my thinking more than almost anything else in his correspondence. He wrote that the devil attacked him through the imagination, filling it with images of shameful things that he had never personally done, acts he had never committed, scenes he had never witnessed, but which tormented him as if they were his own memories. Read that carefully. Padre Pio was a man who had, by 1912, spent years in a friary. He had not been to war. He had not consumed violent entertainment. He had not been exposed to the volume of degraded imagery that even the most careful person in our era is routinely exposed to simply by owning a telephone. And still, his imagination was filled with material that did not come from his own experience. The enemy had sourced it from elsewhere and deposited it into the one faculty through which he could reach the passions, the imagination. Padre Pio drew from this a pastoral conclusion that runs through his letters across decades. The imagination is the primary gateway through which the enemy reaches the human soul. Guard it with the same vigilance you would guard the entrance to your home in a time of war. He understood the senses as doorways, language he used explicitly in his letters. The senses are the doors of the soul. What passes through those doors furnishes the interior. This is not Padre Pio's invention. It is the same truth that Jesus stated plainly in Matthew 6, verse 22. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is evil, your whole body will be full of darkness. Padre Pio cited this verse directly. When discussing what he called custody of the senses, he was not offering a pious suggestion. He was identifying the mechanism. Now here is the detail that Ripperger's framework supplies, and that changes everything when you apply it to the 26,000 hours. Demons cannot create images from nothing. This is a precise theological claim, not a metaphor. It is rooted in the same Thomistic anthropology that Padre Pio's entire spiritual framework was built upon. Demons are not omnipotent. They cannot produce a new image in the imagination that has no prior source in sensory experience. What they can do, and what they do with considerable skill, is recombine, amplify, and deploy images that the imagination has already received. They are not artists. They are editors. They work with existing material. Before the age of mass media, this meant that a demon working on an ordinary person had a relatively limited raw material supply. Real-world experiences, remembered scenes, the emotional residue of wounds and relationships. The imagination of someone living in 1890 was furnished by a few hundred hours of direct sensory experience per year. That is the raw material the enemy had to work with. Think carefully about what has changed. A person who has spent 10 years as an average American consumer of digital media has delivered to the demonic editor working on them a library of roughly 26,000 hours of emotionally charged imagery. Fear content, lust content, rage content, envy content, despair content, violence, betrayal, humiliation, shame. Each frame stored in the imagination, available for retrieval and recombination at any hour of the day or night. The editor now has everything he needs. He does not need to invent the image of your family in danger. You have watched 50 crime dramas that did it for him. He does not need to construct the impression of divine abandonment. You have seen 10 films depicting a universe without God, and the emotional residue of those films sits in the memory, available for deployment at 3 in the morning when the defenses are low. Padre Pio refused to own a television. His biographer, Padre Alessandro da Ripperger, documented that when a television was briefly placed in his friary at San Giovanni Rotondo, Padre Pio reacted with visible discomfort and would not remain in the room. He did not use the language of media criticism. He said that anything which occupied the mind with images not directed toward God was a preparation for the enemy's work. Not a moral failing in the first instance, a tactical preparation. He saw the television set the way a military officer might see a supply line being established behind enemy lines, not the attack itself, but the logistical infrastructure that makes the attack possible and effective. Now here is where it gets uncomfortable. Ripperger has documented something in his lecture work that I want to present as precisely as I can. He has documented that Satanist operatives who had infiltrated Hollywood studios and the pornographic distribution industry in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s performed ritual cursings on master copies of film and other content. The theological mechanism. A curse applied to a master copy is inherited by every subsequent copy, reproduction, and distribution. Every digital stream that traces its lineage to those cursed master copies carries the energetic residue of the original occult act. Among the documented effects is an amplification of the addictive properties of the content, meaning that the ordinary gravitational pull of entertaining material is augmented by a specifically occult intensification of compulsion. He is not speaking about niche material. He is speaking about mainstream Hollywood output. He is speaking about the ordinary streaming library available to any American household tonight. The devout Catholic who settles into the couch after Mass on Sunday to watch a Netflix series is, in Ripperger's framework, voluntarily exposing themselves to content carrying the residual energy of deliberate occult corruption, and simultaneously delivering that content into the imagination, the one faculty through which the enemy accesses the interior life. There is a report from ZENIT, published in March of 2024, that I have returned to repeatedly since I first read it. The report compiled the testimony of multiple exorcists operating internationally, in Europe, South America, and the United States, who were asked whether they had observed changes in the frequency and character of diabolical obsession since the widespread adoption of smartphones beginning in approximately 2008. The answer was consistent across all of them. Obsession cases have multiplied, and the predominant symptom, the inability to stop compulsive thought loops, maps with disturbing precision onto the behavioral pattern produced by algorithm-induced scrolling. Here is what Ripperger defines as diabolic obsession. Demons besiege the imagination to such a degree that the person cannot think outside of a given passion. They feel trapped in a loop of imagery and emotional response they cannot exit through willpower alone. Now consider how social media scrolling is described by every behavioral researcher who has studied it in the last decade. An escalating feed of emotionally charged content, fear, outrage, lust, comparison, grief, designed by an algorithm to maximize the specific response that produces continued engagement. Stopping requires effort that feels disproportionate to the apparent simplicity of the action. The person pulls the phone out, scrolls for 30 seconds, and suddenly it is 40 minutes later. I am not making an analogy. I am describing the same mechanism. The diabolic obsession siege is structurally identical to algorithm-induced scrolling, the escalating image loop, the inability to exit through ordinary willpower, the emotional engagement that produces not resolution, but more engagement. And the siege is now running 24 hours a day through a device most people sleep next to. The imagination is being conditioned through years of daily screen use to accept a constant stream of incoming imagery without the intervention of the will. The person is training their own faculty of imagination to be permanently open, to receive whatever is fed into it, without resistance, without examination, without the recollection that Padre Pio identified as the soul's primary defense. And when the imagination is permanently open, the enemy does not need to knock. Stay with me here, this is where it matters. I need to tell you about Brian. I had not heard from Brian in 12 years when he contacted me at the parish after a talk I gave on Padre Pio's letters and spiritual warfare. This was about 14 months ago. He had made the drive specifically to speak with me afterward. Brian is in his early 40s. He was a student of mine at 17, one of the serious ones, the kind you remember. He has been married for 15 years, 3 children. He goes to Sunday Mass, sometimes daily Mass. He says the Rosary. He has never, in the years he described to me, missed his monthly confession. By every external measure, Brian was living a devout Catholic life. He waited until most of the group had cleared out of the parish hall, then sat down next to me. He did not look embarrassed. He looked puzzled in a particular way, the way a person looks when they have been trying to solve a problem that should be solvable, but isn't. He said, "Raymond, for 4 years I have had thoughts, violent thoughts. They arrive in the morning, usually before I am fully awake. Scenes from crime dramas, images of violence that I recognize from shows I have watched, but they arrive as if they belong to me, as if I am thinking them on purpose, but I am not. They are completely against my character." He paused. "Then I have confessed these thoughts dozens of times. Not the shows or the thoughts. I confess that I had intrusive, violent thoughts. The priests give absolution. The thoughts keep coming back." I asked him the question that Ripperger trained me indirectly to ask, because it is not a question I would have known to ask 30 years ago before I understood the mechanism. I asked him, "What do you watch?" He looked at me for a moment, as if he wasn't sure why I had changed the subject. Then he told me. 3 or 4 crime dramas per week, well-made ones, the kind that win awards. An hour or 2 of crime or thriller content on most evenings after the children were in bed, plus the nightly news, which in the current era means 30 to 60 minutes of curated violence and catastrophe in an emotional register designed to keep the viewer engaged. By his own estimate, 8 to 10 hours per week of violent or high-stress imagery, consistently for 4 or 5 years. I asked one more question. "Have you ever named the shows specifically in confession? Not the thoughts, the deliberate repeated consumption of violent content as an entertainment practice?" He said no, he had never considered it. Not because he was morally negligent, because in the framework most of us received in Catholic education, what you watch is a matter of personal taste and cultural discernment, not a spiritual act with theological consequences. The shows were not pornographic. They were not occult-themed. They were crime dramas, the kind that win Emmy Awards. No one had ever told Brian that voluntarily and repeatedly filling the imagination with violent imagery was an act with a specific consequence in the domain of spiritual warfare. No one had explained that he was, night after night, increasing the enemy's supply of material that could be recombined and deployed against him without his consent. He had confessed the symptom dozens of times. He had never confessed the cause, because he had never known the cause was a confessable act. I walked him through what I had learned from Ripperger's framework and from Padre Pio's letters. I explained the imagination as the primary gateway. I explained that demons cannot create images from nothing. They can only recombine what is stored. I explained that 4 years of regular crime drama consumption had handed the enemy several thousand hours of raw material, and that the intrusive, violent thoughts were not coming from Brian's character or Brian's will. They were coming from the library. Brian looked at me with the expression of a person to whom something obvious has just been explained for the first time. Not surprise exactly, recognition. He said, "I gave him the material and then couldn't understand why he was using it. That is precisely it. I walked him through the screen audit and imagination cleansing protocol. He went home and followed it. He eliminated the crime dramas for 7 days. Then he made a complete confession, the kind that included not the symptom, not the intrusive thoughts, but the cause. The 4-year pattern of voluntarily and repeatedly filling the imagination with violent content without ever examining the spiritual consequence. He named it specifically. He named the shows. He described the pattern. Within 6 weeks, 6 weeks of partial screen fast, a complete confession naming the pattern, and the morning recollection prayer, the intrusive thoughts stopped, not reduced, not quieter, stopped. His confessor, who had been hearing his confession for 4 years and administering absolution for the symptom without being told about the cause, noted the change immediately. The priest, who had some formation in spiritual warfare, confirmed what I had told him. The intrusive thoughts had not been coming from Brian. They had been coming from the library. Closing the library had removed the material. Now I need to name the specific mechanism that allowed this to continue even through regular confession. Ripperger's framework identifies what he calls legal rights. These are not a metaphor. They are a precise description of the spiritual permission structure that governs how much access a demonic entity may exercise over a given person. The baseline condition of a baptized Catholic in a state of grace is protected. The enemy has no legitimate claim on the soul, but the enemy acquires legal rights, specific points of access, through specific acts and conditions. Ripperger identifies prolonged voluntary exposure to content involving lust, violence, and occult themes as one of the clearest generators of legal rights he observes in his pastoral work. The critical word is voluntary. This is not about accidental exposure. This is about habitual, deliberate, repeated choices to fill the imagination with material that empowers the enemy's primary mechanism of attack. And the theological consequence, the part that Brian's confessor had no information about, is that the legal rights generated by 4 years of voluntary violent content consumption cannot be removed through confessing the symptoms of the attack. They are removed through confessing the practice that generated them. The absolution administered over Brian's intrusive violent thoughts was valid. It covered what Brian had actually confessed, but the legal rights generated by the content consumption remained active. Because the content consumption had never been named, examined, or surrendered, the door had not been named, and a door that has not been named cannot be closed. This is the part of the framework that I wish I had understood 30 years ago. The legal rights generated by habitual media consumption can persist, invisibly, without the person's awareness, even in Catholics who are going to Mass weekly, confessing monthly, and praying the Rosary daily. The sacramental life addresses what the sacramental life has been presented with. It cannot address what has been withheld from it, whether by deliberate concealment or by simple ignorance. Brian did not withhold the pattern deliberately. He withheld it out of ignorance. He did not know it was a spiritual act with spiritual consequences. The enemy understood this perfectly. Let me give you the screen audit and imagination cleansing protocol. 5 steps. Specific and actionable, drawn from the framework Padre Pio built across 50 years of confessional ministry and from Ripperger's clinical pastoral work. The first step is the confession audit of media consumption. Before your next confession, this week, not eventually, sit with paper, not a phone, and answer honestly. In the past 12 months, what have I regularly watched that involved pornographic content? Graphic or sustained violence? Occult themes? Witchcraft, Satanism, communication with the dead presented as normal or heroic? Sustained mockery of God or the Church? These are questions about the raw material you have voluntarily supplied to the enemy's primary attack mechanism. Name each category specifically. Name the shows if you can. Then bring that list into your examination of conscience. Not a vague sense of having watched some things that were probably not ideal. The specific practice, the specific shows. the specific hours per week, the specific duration in years. Name it in confession as a pattern, not as isolated acts. Ripperger is explicit. These are legal rights, actively generated by the voluntary and repeated practice. They must be confessed as a practice and surrendered with a firm purpose of amendment. The priest does not need to know the plot of every crime drama. He needs to know, I have habitually consumed violent content over an extended period without examining the spiritual consequences, and I am confessing this as a pattern. That is the confession that removes the legal right. The second step is the 7-day partial screen fast. Choose one category of screen consumption to eliminate for 7 days beginning tonight. The recommended target is social media scrolling, not because it is the most obviously problematic content, but because the scrolling algorithm is structurally the most precise replication of the diabolic obsession mechanism. This is not about willpower. It is about withdrawing the raw material. A demon who is editing a film cannot continue editing if the footage stops arriving. You are reducing the incoming material in the imagination's library and creating the condition of interior quiet, recollection in Padre Pio's language, that the enemy cannot easily work within. 7 days. One category. Begin tonight. The third step is the Padre Pio morning recollection prayer. Before you look at any screen in the morning, before the phone, before the news, before anything, spend 3 minutes in silence and pray this: Lord, recollect my soul within you. Let nothing enter through my senses today that does not first pass through your hands. Guard my imagination. Guard the door through which the enemy works. I place my attention at your disposal and refuse to place it at anyone else's. This is the traditional form of the morning offering of the senses that Padre Pio practiced daily throughout his priestly life. He did not pray it as a formality. He prayed it as a tactical positioning of the most important faculty before the day's assault began. If you look at the phone before you pray this prayer, you have opened the door before you have set the guard. The morning is when the imagination is most receptive. It has just emerged from sleep in a state of maximum openness. The first imagery received in the morning sets the interior tone for the hours that follow. 3 minutes before the screen, every morning. The fourth step is a house blessing, naming the screens. Contact your parish priest this week and ask him to bless your home with specific intention over the digital devices present: televisions, computers, phones, tablets. Ripperger has noted in his pastoral work that devices can carry residual energetic attachments from content viewed over years of use. A formal house blessing performed by a priest with specific intention naming the screens is a documented exorcistic practice. Ask him to use the traditional house blessing form and tell him, I am asking specifically for the blessing to address the screens and digital devices in the home and any spiritual residue associated with their use. The fifth step is the evening imagination examination. Before sleep, spend 3 minutes in silence and ask yourself 2 questions. What did I allow into my imagination today through screens? Was it directed toward God or toward the enemy's material? Then make a brief act of contrition, specific, not general, for the specific content you consumed today that, in honest examination, was furnishing the enemy's library rather than directing the interior toward God. Ripperger has noted something specific about the sleep hours. The will is less active during sleep. The passions continue to process the material stored in the imagination throughout the night. A person who falls asleep after 2 hours of violent or emotionally charged content has left the imagination in a specific state, fully furnished with activated material, with the will temporarily inactive, and with the hours of darkness ahead in which the enemy's mechanism operates with maximum effectiveness. The evening examination is the practice of setting the guard before the night watch begins, naming what entered today, surrendering what was negligent, positioning the imagination toward God before sleep. Give it something worth processing. Let me close with what has stayed with me since Brian came to that parish talk 14 months ago. I spent 35 years teaching Catholic high school students everything I had been trained to teach them: theology, scripture, prayer, sacramental life, moral formation. I never once explained to any of them what the imagination is, why it is theologically significant, or what voluntarily filling it with continuous violent content actually does in the framework of spiritual warfare. I never taught it because I did not know it. The modern Catholic formation framework has largely adopted the cultural consensus about media consumption. Be discerning. Avoid the obviously pornographic. Use your judgment. That is sound advice as far as it goes. It does not go far enough. It does not explain that the imagination is the primary battlefield. It does not explain that demons work exclusively with material already stored there. It does not explain that 8 hours per week of crime drama over 4 years, material that is well made, critically acclaimed, and consumed by every Catholic in the parish, is furnishing a weapons cache that will be used against the soul in the hours when the will is least active and the passions are most exposed. Brian spent 4 years confessing the symptom without anyone ever helping him see the cause. Not because his confessors were negligent, because no one in his formation had ever given him the framework to identify it. Padre Pio had the framework. He built it across 50 years of watching the pattern, watching the same penitents return with the same wounds, watching the cycle of partial relief and return, observing the interior life of millions of people whose imaginations he could perceive with the directness that decades of mystical experience had sharpened to an edge. He refused the radio not because he was a strict traditionalist. He refused it because he understood exactly what it was doing to the interior life of the soul. He had watched the pattern across his penitents long enough to see it clearly. He did not have the language of algorithms or screen time or digital media. He had something more precise. He had the data. What Padre Pio understood, what he spent 50 years trying to help penitents understand, is that the war is not fought in dramatic moments of obvious temptation. It is fought in the small choices made in every ordinary evening. The choice of what to allow through the door, the choice of what to furnish the room with, and the choice of whether to examine in honest confession what the door has been left open for. Tonight I am asking you to make one specific choice. Not a dramatic renunciation, not a complete overhaul of your media habits tonight. One choice. Choose one of the 5 steps in the protocol and do it tonight. If nothing else before you sleep, 3 minutes. The examination. What entered the imagination today? What am I handing the enemy to work with tonight? And if there is something you recognize in what I have described, if there are thoughts that arrive without invitation, imagery that recycles in ways you cannot stop, interior experiences that confession has not removed, consider the possibility that the confession has been incomplete. Not because you are a bad Catholic, not because the priests who have given you absolution were wrong, because the cause has never been named. Padre Pio's confessional was the oldest precision diagnostic tool in the tradition, not a place of judgment, a place of surgical accuracy. He sent penitents away not to punish them, but because he saw that the wound had not been fully presented. A wound that has not been fully presented cannot be fully treated. Name the wound, not the symptom, the wound, the practice, the voluntary repeated choice to fill the imagination with what you now understand to be the enemy's preferred raw material. Name it specifically. Surrender it with a firm purpose of amendment. Let the sacrament reach the level where the legal right was actually granted, and then do the morning prayer. Before the screen, before the phone. 3 minutes with the guard at the door. This is what Padre Pio prescribed. Not as devotion, as defense. The imagination is the battlefield. Guard it tonight. Take this with you. God bless you and stay vigilant.